What happens when a seemingly perfect life turns into a living nightmare? A woman on the run, a past filled with betrayal, and a danger she can never escape. Stay with us till the end to uncover the shocking twist in this chilling tale of love, revenge, and survival. Will she find freedom, or is she trapped forever? Don't blink. This story will leave you on the edge of your seat. The air was thick, stale, like it hadn't moved in days. A low hum buzzed from the corner of the room. It was the only sound in the silence. The walls felt oppressive, suffocating. Outside, the heavy drizzle tapped against the window. Inside, the room smelled of old leather and burnt coffee. Allison stood by the door, her hands trembling. She could feel the sweat pooling in her palms. The sudden chill crawled down her spine. Her shoes scraped against the floor, sending echoes through the empty house. She had never felt so alone. Every step seemed to take longer, heavier. As she moved through the hall, the darkness seemed to reach out for her. A creak. A faint sound from upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. She told herself it was nothing, just the house settling. But it didn't feel like that. She paused, staring into the dimness. The soft rustling seemed to grow louder. A shadow flickered at the top of the stairs. Her heart raced. It wasn't her imagination. She knew someone was up there. Someone she hadn't expected. "Darren," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. The rustling stopped. She froze. No answer. Just the pounding of her pulse in her ears. Slowly, Allison climbed the stairs. Her legs felt weak, as if they were made of rubber. Each step felt like a battle. Her mind screamed at her to turn around, to run. But something kept her moving forward. She reached the landing. A door at the end of the hallway. She could see the faint outline of it, barely illuminated by the light from downstairs. The doorknob gleamed in the dimness. It turned. The air shifted. And then, a voice, low and guttural, whispered from the darkness. "Thought you could escape me, didn't you?" Her blood ran cold. The voice so familiar, yet distorted. Darren. But he wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this. Allison's breath hitched. Her body tensed, frozen in place. The voice came again, closer now, cutting through the air like a knife. "You really thought you could leave me?" it growled. A shadow shifted just beyond the door. Her pulse hammered in her neck. She should have turned around. She should have run. But her feet stayed glued to the floor. The door creaked open just a fraction. A sliver of light fell across the floor. And then, Darren's face emerged from the darkness. It was not the face she remembered. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, as if he hadn't slept in days. His jaw was clenched, muscles twitching. He didn't look like the man she once loved. He looked broken, dangerous. Allison could feel the air in the room change. The weight of his gaze pressed down on her. Her throat closed up. Her fingers clenched into fists. What had happened to him? What had she done? "I gave you everything," he muttered, his voice trembling with rage. "You took it all away." Allison's chest tightened. Her heart pounded louder. His words didn't make sense. But the look in his eyes, she understood it now. It was betrayal. And it burned deeper than any love. Darren took a step forward. Allison stepped back. The walls seemed to close in on her. His breath was hot, heavy, and it stank of alcohol. He wasn't the man she had married. He wasn't the man who had once promised to love her forever. He was someone else now. Someone consumed by anger, revenge, and madness. And in that moment, Allison realized something that chilled her to the core. There was no escaping him now. Not anymore. The floor creaked under his weight as he took another step. Allison's back pressed against the wall. She wanted to scream, to shout for help. But her voice wouldn't come. She could barely breathe. The room was suffocating. The shadows in the corners seemed to twist, watching. Darren's lips curled into a twisted grin. He reached into his jacket pocket. Allison's eyes locked onto the dark shape in his hand. A gleaming knife. Her stomach dropped. The cold metal shimmered in the faint light. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. He didn't say a word. He just kept smiling, the madness creeping further across his face. "Darren, please," she whispered. Her voice was barely audible, trembling. He didn't respond. The knife glinted. He stepped closer. Her heart was pounding so hard, she felt like it might break out of her chest. The silence between them was unbearable. She wanted to run, but her legs were frozen, locked in place. Darren raised the knife. Allison's breath hitched. The sound of it slicing through the air was deafening. He moved so quickly, it was like he was everywhere at once. She barely had time to react. Her hand shot out to defend herself, but it was too late. The blade grazed her arm, a sharp, burning pain that sent waves of shock through her body. She gasped, the blood starting to pool on the floor beneath her. Her vision blurred. The pain, it was unbearable. She stumbled back, her legs giving way. The room spun around her, the darkness closing in. But Darren didn't stop. He kept coming, his eyes never leaving hers. He was lost to something else now, to something darker. And in the back of her mind, a single thought kept repeating. She was never meant to leave. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body trembling from the pain. The blood trickled down her arm, staining her clothes. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Darren's figure loomed over her, his eyes wild with fury. He was closer now, too close. The knife gleamed in his hand, as if it had a life of its own. Allison's heart raced. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs wouldn't obey. Her vision was blurred, the room spinning around her. The pain was overwhelming, but she couldn't stop now. Not yet. She had to get away, had to survive. But Darren was relentless. With a swift motion, he grabbed her by the wrist, pulling her up with a strength that felt unnatural. She gasped, her body protesting. The room seemed to close in tighter, the walls pressing against her chest. "Please, Darren," she whispered, her voice weak. "I never wanted this. I just wanted to be free." His grip tightened, his face twisted with anger. "You took everything from me," he snarled. "You think you can walk away? You think you can just throw it all away?" His voice was like a slap, each word a lash that cut deeper into her soul. Her heart pounded so loudly, she thought it might burst. She could feel the weight of the knife in his hand. It was only inches from her chest. But then, something inside her snapped. A surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She fought against him, twisting her body out of his grasp. With a desperate lunge, her hand shot out and grabbed for something, anything. Her fingers closed around the edge of a broken vase on the floor. In a single, violent motion, she swung it up, smashing it against Darren's face. The glass shattered, shards flying in every direction. Darren staggered back, a shocked expression spreading across his face. Blood streamed from his forehead, mixing with the rain of glass around him. Allison's pulse hammered in her ears. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. She had a chance. She had a chance to escape. But Darren's voice broke through the silence. "This isn't over," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. And as she stumbled back, her body still trembling, Allison realized one horrifying truth. She wasn't the only one trapped in this nightmare. And Darren wasn't the only one who couldn't let go. Allison's breath came in ragged bursts, her chest rising and falling with panic. The adrenaline surged through her, but her body was already weary. Her heart was still racing, the blood dripping from her arm, making her lightheaded. Darren wiped the blood from his forehead with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving hers. She could see the madness in them now. The fury was only growing. She backed away slowly, her legs unsteady. Her mind screamed for her to run. But where could she go? This house, this place, felt like it was swallowing her whole. The hallway stretched before her like an endless maze, doors closing in from all sides. Her thoughts swirled in confusion, but one thing was clear. She couldn't let him get to her again. Her feet barely touched the ground as she turned and bolted for the stairs. She had to get outside. She had to get away. But Darren was faster. Before she could make it halfway, his hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. Allison gasped, her heart leaping into her throat. The knife was back in his hand, the glint of it catching the dim light. It was too much. Too close. "You're mine," Darren growled, dragging her back toward the door. Every fiber of her being screamed for freedom. She struggled, twisting in his grip, but his hold was unyielding. Her breath hitched as he shoved her toward the dark hallway. The house seemed to breathe with them, the walls pressing in tighter. Allison could barely see through the blur of her tears, but she didn't stop fighting. She couldn't. There was no way she was going down without a fight. With all her strength, she jerked free from his grasp for a split second, but it was enough. She darted toward the window at the far end of the hall. The glass was thick, but her hands were shaking, desperate. Darren's footsteps thundered behind her. He was too close. But her fingers grasped the window latch, and she threw it open, her body propelled by sheer will. The cold night air rushed in, sharp and biting. The world outside felt so far away, but it was her only chance. With one final, frantic push, she clambered out of the window, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she landed hard on the ground below, she felt the weight of her body crumble beneath her. The pain from the cut on her arm flared again, and she couldn't breathe. The cold, damp earth under her felt like an anchor pulling her down. She looked back toward the house. Darren was standing in the window. His face was a twisted mask of rage and disbelief. Allison's vision blurred again. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she saw him. But this was her moment. Her one chance to escape. And she wasn't going to let him take it away.
Not now.
Not ever. Allison stumbled to her feet, the pain in her arms searing through her body. She forced herself to move, each step heavy, each breath a struggle. The cold air bit at her skin, but it was a relief compared to the suffocating heat inside that house. She could hear Darren's voice echoing through the night, though she couldn't make out the words. It was enough to send a shiver down her spine. The house loomed behind her, dark and oppressive, like a creature waiting to pounce. Allison's feet dragged as she moved through the overgrown yard, the wet grass sticking to her shoes. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. The shadows in the distance seemed to shift, taunting her. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out all other sounds. The wind rustled the trees, making the branches creak. Her thoughts were scattered, broken into fragments. How had it come to this? How had she let him change so completely? Her mind kept returning to the shattered look in his eyes. The man she had married, he was gone. What remained was something monstrous, something unrecognizable. The further she moved away from the house, the more she felt the weight of the night pressing in on her. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. She could hear the distant hum of traffic, but the emptiness of the world around her felt like it had swallowed everything. Allison's legs were shaking, and she couldn't keep going much longer. But she had to. She couldn't stop.
Not now.
Not when she was so close. The road was up ahead, its black asphalt stretching into the darkness, an endless ribbon that promised freedom. A car approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the dark. Allison's heart leaped. She didn't know how she would explain everything. She didn't know if they'd even believe her. But she had no choice. She flagged down the car with trembling hands, her body still shaking with fear and exhaustion. The car slowed as it neared, and the driver rolled down the window. A middle-aged man, confused, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong, miss?" he asked, his voice concerned. Allison could barely speak, her throat dry, her voice cracking. "Please," she gasped. "I need help."
Please, he's coming.
He's. Before she could finish, a scream pierced the night. Allison turned, her blood running cold. Darren was there, standing at the edge of the yard, his figure barely visible in the shadows. He was moving toward her, quick, determined. She could see the rage in his eyes even from this distance. The man in the car looked over, his expression shifting to confusion, then fear. "You need to get in," he urged, throwing the car door open. Allison didn't hesitate. She rushed into the car, slamming the door shut behind her. The man floored the gas pedal, and they sped off into the night. But even as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, a chilling thought gnawed at her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Darren would come for her again. And next time, she wouldn't be able to run. The car tore through the night, its tires screaming against the asphalt as it raced down the empty road. Allison's heart was still pounding, her breath ragged, but the distance between her and Darren was growing. For now, she was safe. But the fear that gripped her never loosened. Her body trembled, the cold sweat still clinging to her skin. The man behind the wheel glanced over at her, his eyes full of concern. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Allison didn't know how to answer. How could she? How could she explain the terror she had just fled from? How could she explain Darren? She started, but her words faltered. How could she explain a love turned to poison? "He's gone mad," she whispered, barely able to say the words. The man didn't respond at first, but his eyes softened as he glanced at her again. "Where are we headed?" he asked, keeping his eyes on the road. She didn't know. She had no plan. Only instinct. "I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I just need to get away." The car sped on, the world outside a blur of lights and shadows. Allison's thoughts were a tangle of fear and disbelief. How could Darren have changed so completely? How could someone she had once trusted turn into something so dangerous? The man, sensing her distress, didn't push her further. He simply drove. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The city lights began to fade behind them, replaced by open fields and stretches of blackness. Allison's mind drifted back to the moments before she'd escaped. She could still hear Darren's voice, low, guttural. "Thought you could escape me, didn't you?" The words echoed in her mind, a constant reminder that this wasn't over. That Darren was still out there, waiting. And even though she was miles away, she felt the pull of his presence, as if his darkness still clung to her. The road ahead was long, endless. But as they drove further, a small sliver of hope sparked in Allison's chest. Maybe she could start over. Maybe for the first time in years, she could feel free again. But then, as if on cue, the rearview mirror caught a flicker of movement. Allison's breath caught. A car, speeding toward them from the distance. Her stomach dropped. Her hand reached instinctively for the door handle. "Please," she whispered to herself, "not again." But it was too late. The headlights drew nearer, faster, until the car slammed into theirs with a deafening crash. Allison was thrown forward, her body jolted violently, her head slamming against the window. Pain exploded across her skull. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. All she could hear was the screech of metal on metal, the sounds of chaos filling the air. And through it all, she knew Darren had found her. The car was spun around by the impact, tires screeching, the sound of metal grinding against metal like nails on a chalkboard. Allison's body was thrown forward, then slammed back against the seat, her head whiplashing with the force. The world spun in dizzying circles, the blinding flash of headlights searing into her eyes. For a moment, everything was still. But only for a moment. The sharp sound of a door opening, a footstep, and then the unmistakable voice. "Did you really think you could get away?" Allison's pulse hammered in her ears. She turned her head, barely able to focus through the haze of pain. The man beside her, the stranger who had tried to help, was unconscious, slumped over the wheel. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, and he didn't move. Allison tried to move too, but her body felt heavy, like lead. Her vision blurred as she struggled to stay awake, struggling to stay conscious. Darren was walking toward the car, his figure dark and imposing, outlined by the flashing lights of his vehicle. Every step he took seemed to shake the very ground beneath her. Her hands gripped the seat, the cold leather digging into her palms.
No.
She couldn't let him win. Not like this. She forced her eyes open, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Darren reached the car, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "Why did you do this?" His laugh was low, almost mocking. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his face twisted into a sneer. "You were never meant to leave me. You were never meant to leave what we built. I gave you everything. Everything." Allison's hand reached into her jacket pocket, fingers brushing over something cold. A small, forgotten key. A glimmer of hope. With the last of her strength, she reached for it, her fingers closing around it. "You'll never escape," Darren said, his voice thick with venom. Allison didn't reply. She couldn't, but she didn't need to. She slid the key into the ignition with trembling hands, the engine sputtering to life. A burst of strength she didn't know she had shot through her as she slammed the gas pedal. The car jerked forward, the tires screeching as they tore across the road. Darren's figure blurred in the rearview mirror, growing smaller, farther away. But the fear that had lodged itself in her heart didn't fade. Not yet. She wasn't free.
Not yet. But she would be.
One way or another. The road stretched ahead, dark and endless, but Allison kept her hands firmly on the wheel, her grip steady. The car surged forward, the engine roaring beneath her. She had no idea where she was going. No plan, no destination. Only the instinct to put as much distance between herself and Darren as possible. Her head throbbed from the crash, her vision still slightly blurry, but she didn't dare stop. She couldn't. The night seemed to close in around her as the miles slipped by. The empty road was her only companion, the only witness to the storm inside her chest. She was terrified, no doubt about it. But there was something else, too. Something powerful, something burning in her soul. Survival. The headlights of the car illuminated the endless stretch of asphalt ahead, but Allison wasn't sure if they were leading her to safety or deeper into the unknown. Every mile that passed felt like a heartbeat, steady but relentless. She finally allowed herself a breath, the first real one she'd taken in what felt like forever. The tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her chest, began to loosen just a little. Darren was still out there. She knew that. His shadow would always linger in the corners of her mind. But she couldn't live in fear of him anymore. She couldn't let him define her life. For so long, she had been trapped in a nightmare of her own making, believing that love could conquer all, even when that love had turned toxic. But now, in the solitude of the night, she knew the truth. Some things couldn't be fixed. And some people, no matter how much you loved them, weren't meant to be saved. The road curved ahead, leading her into the unknown. And for the first time in years, Allison felt a spark of hope. The past would always be with her, a shadow she couldn't outrun. But the future? That was hers to reclaim. With a steady breath, she pressed the gas pedal just a little harder, her heart beating in sync with the engine's hum. The night no longer felt so dark. It felt like freedom, and it was just within reach.